So it's so awful, like the things that these boys are doing. But we're seeing more and more of these youngsters, like Georgie Pete and Dim, like the Rebellious Son. We're seeing more and more of these people, these young kids, young men and young women. I see more and more and more of them on the streets of Albuquerque than I used to. Or maybe I'm just getting older. What do you think?
So you're saying you see more of these ham-fisted, two-fisted, grabbing onto things in the world. That's what you're describing?
I'm seeing more and more kids, it seems, younger kids who are out on the streets of Albuquerque, who are addicted to fentanyl, who are hooked on drugs, who are unhoused, who are homeless. I'm not saying that violent crime is on the rise, particularly among young people, but people that we know, like Pastor Chuck, the Pope of the International District, Joanne Landry, they all testify that the crowds are younger now than they were 10 years ago.
So
what do we do with that?
Yes. Well, there's a couple things that I wanted to touch on, and I'll work my way backwards. Yes, there are more younger and older people who are unhoused across the board. Now, if you were to go back 10, 15 years, it wasn't always seen as true homelessness if mother or father raising kids in a single parent household went to live with their parents. That still qualifies under the designation of homeless, right? It's the same thing. The challenge that we've had, and this is going back to 2008 and prior to that, there was a major economic recession in 2008. That economic recession caused the cost of housing, interest rates, from an economic standpoint, right? I'm not an economist, but from an economic standpoint, the cost of inflation and the cost of interest rates are inverse, right? So they operate differently, right? So when people don't have any money and you're trying to get them to borrow money, you have to lower interest rates. If the interest rates are too high, it negatively impacts inflation, right? So that's what we have the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who's been in the news, because he's drug into the news by the nature of his job. That's where that discussion comes from. So we can't say that 2025 happens in a vacuum, because 17 years ago, you see younger kids, 17 years ago, people were impacted economically on a scale that hadn't happened in many years. And it cost people housing. We had, most very recently, at the onset of COVID, the cost of lumber, right? Because people weren't cutting trees. Lumber rose exponentially. And so what you used to be able to pay for housing, say, and I'm going to put some numbers out there. If a house in Albuquerque, like this one here, this house would have cost $120,000 in 2020. A house like this now is going for $350,000. Like, that is not a small increase. And so the cost to build a home went, like a 1,500, 2,000 square foot home, went from like 60 to 80,000 to 150 to 210,000. Just the cost of making things went up. Now, the stuff that happened in 2008, it wasn't just in 2008 that things got bad. It was the years leading up to it. And it wasn't fixed by 2009. It was the years following it. And you've heard people saying, and they're not necessarily wrong, again, I'm not an economist, that we are on the verge of different market collapses, whether it's a housing market, whether it's a stock, bond, treasury market. Tariffs are impacting. Like, things are more expensive. And when things are more expensive, people can't afford things. And so they end up, unhoused. Again, I'm not an economist. Minimum wage. Federal minimum wage is not a livable wage, right? $7.65 an hour. It hasn't gone up in 20 years, right?
Yeah.
In New Mexico, minimum wage is $12 an hour. Now, I'm not an economist, but I have been a business owner, right? And so if I own a business and I go from having to pay someone who is producing minimum wage work, I can no longer pay them $7.65. I now have to pay them $12 an hour. Somebody has to pay that cost.
Yeah.
And so it gets passed on to the consumer. Things are more expensive. People can't afford them. And that applies to housing. So sometimes you're like, do I buy food or do I pay for a place to live?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's one thing. The other part of it, like you're talking about, the gluttony and one of the things that drives me insane is like plastic that gets just disposed of, like glitter, right? Glitter is the most garish sign of false wealth that exists in the world that we live in today. You go down to the dollar store, whatever store of the dollar variety you want to name, and you can buy these plastic glittery shiny things that project false wealth that end up all over the environment and in our very bodies.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right? And so like we are just so tone deaf to the kind of gluttony that we live in, that we want so desperately to be rich in our poverty, right? Let him who says he is rich realize that he is poor, right?
Yeah, yeah,
destitute. Come and buy bread from me instead, right? Like we live in such a tenuous balance between housed and unhoused, and all of us are a paycheck away from
being where we. Well, it's a shadow now that looms over every family.
Well, that's why you have more unhoused people,
and it's a shadow that looms over. Even my kids. They've grown up being kind of. I know that they think about it. Like, are we going to wind up on the concrete outside? Are we going to wind up
over there?
Yeah. Are we gonna have a place to live? Like, what are we going to do? So, like, I never worried about that when I was their age, but I know that they worry about that now because the world has changed so much. Now, as people get older, they tend to feel less valued.
Yep.
They tend to feel less respected.
Yep.
From the youth.
Yep.
And they're actually afraid of the youth.
Yes.
Right? So this happened to me. There was some kids from Wilson Middle School. And these little guys were skipping school. They were ditching school, and they were on the news. They tried to shoot somebody actually, and I think they put him in YDDC. But they were skipping school, right? They were skipping school at Wilson, and they were coming over, and they were hanging out in the stairwells instead of being in school. And and they were running amok, and they were running through the apartments, and they were.
This is where you are now.
Yeah, over there
in the
by the gateway. Yeah, and they were running up and down the hallways, and they were taking people's Amazon packages off the, because Amazon would just come and just put it in the hallway, and so.
Where else are you gonna put it?
Yeah, and they were, and then they threw some rocks and broke out some windows. Of some of the tenants, and I remember that they were hanging around on the stairwell, and I don't remember what I was doing, but I could hear them like hanging around on the stairwell, and so like I knew that they didn't live there. And this was when we really had to pay attention where I lived, because there was a guy that was breaking into cars. And he broke into a bunch of cars, and like he kept doing it, and he kept doing it
inside the gated.
Yeah, and he kept getting away. So like everybody was on alert, trying. They had pictures and everything, trying to find this kid who was breaking into cars, because like your car could be next. And so we were supposed to like report any strange people, and like these little guys were out there on the stairwell, and I remember I went out there. And I said, hey, what are you guys doing? I said, you guys live here? And I remember this little kid, and he was all, F you, buddy, man. He was all, you don't want me to get mad, And, but for just a moment, like I was like, I felt kind of afraid, and then I had to remember who I was, how old I was, what I'd been through.
Right.
And then I remembered, like, he's just a little kid.
Yeah.
But the vibrato, the braggadocious, the gall, the already trying to intimidate, and like, just a few months later, these little guys were ditching school. They had a gun and they shot at this kid and they put him all in juvenile hall. So like, it is a real thing.
Yep.
So, but like older people, like, they are afraid of the youth. And this is where we have the scene in Clockwork Orange where the old man is drunk in the alley.
In the alley.
And and they're going to roll a drunk, right? And this is what he says. He says, "Go on, do me in, you bastard cowards. I don't want to live anyway, not in a stinking world like this one." I told Dim to lay off a bit then, because it used to interest me sometimes to sloshy what some of these starry decreps had to say about life in the world. And I said, "Oh, and what's so stinking about it?" He cried out, "It's a stinking world because it lets the young get onto the old like you done. And there's no law, no order, no more."
Yep.
A lot of people that are like that, you know.
That scene in the movie is among the best, right?
Yeah.
Because you see Malcolm McDowell playing that part, and I mean, he's just so good at it. The drunk, not as great. The lighting is, it's 1972, right? The lighting
sticks
isn't
a cane
great.
in his sternum.
Yeah.
But
But the way that Malcolm McDowell plays that character, that scene in particular, the way his character is, irrespective of everyone else, really well executed.
Yeah,
scene.
and he doesn't like him because, remember, he says there's one thing I can never stand. Is to hear an old drunkie howling away at the moon, the songs of his forefathers, like a disgusting orchestra gurgling up in his rotten guts.
Yep.
And he's like, I can never stand to see anyone like that, but especially one as old as this one.
Yep.
And like, those are awful things, but like, that's one of the ways that that like that you're getting older. But we also have to remember when we were younger.
Yep.
When I was younger, I didn't want any old people around. When I was younger, the only people I wanted around that were older than me, unless they were cool or they were doing drugs or they could buy me alcohol, pot, or drugs. I remember when I was in high school, I dated girls that were already over 21. And it didn't really matter what they looked like because I knew they could buy me alcohol. I knew they could get me drugs. Because I was a rotten little bastard. I was a bad little kid, So we have to kind of like remember that. Like what we used to be. You remember the old mantra, never trust someone over the age of 30. I took my boys to the mall a couple of weeks ago. Right. And like, I felt bad for them. And I told my wife, I said, we can't take them anymore. And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "They're too old." I was all, "They're too old and we're too old."
Yeah.
I said, "I can't be walking around in there with a bunch of, middle school." And I said, "I feel like a fool, And I said, "We're embarrassing them."
Right.
I said, "We're just going to drop them off from now on, and just let them, they have to grow up and they have to figure these things out, and we can't incubate them and we can't coddle them to death. We can't be that black widow that just looms over their child and tries to keep every bit of danger and every bit of the awfulness of the world, or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of Christians, they totally disagree with that. But I remember when I was a kid and I would go places with my family, and I was a hard-hearted little bastard. I remember the embarrassment and stuff, and a parent will say, "Oh, well, I love him or I love her." Well, you have to love them enough to kind of let him go and kind of let them have their own time with their own friends, and and sometimes that can be hard and difficult because of the world that we live in. But we have to come to a place where you have to let go a little bit.
Yep.
Right? So let's talk about Alex's parents, right? Because Alex's parents, they're afraid of their own son.
Oh,
They're horrified of their
They
own
are
son.
terrified.
And that is actually a picture of a lot of families now. Because Alex gets whatever he wants. Remember, he comes. They don't question where he's been.
Nope.
They don't question what time he comes in.
Nope.
He could come in with blood all over him. He could come in disheveled. He could come in any kind of condition. And what does he do? The minute he comes in, he likes to play Beethoven on his stereo.
Yep.
And he said P&M. No, he said my mother and father. He says they don't bother me anymore. He said I've trained them.
Yep.
I've shown them. He's all, now they take sleeping pills. That way I can play my music as loud as I want any time of the day or night. They're not going to knock on my door. They're not going to bother me because they're afraid of him.
Yeah.
How many parents are afraid of their kids now?
probably a lot.
Yeah.
And there's a mix, right? There's sometimes the abusive parent that is afraid of receiving what they've sown, right?
Yeah.
And then there are kids that are clearly troubled, like Mr. DeLarge is, and those parents, they just don't know what to do. They're at a loss for how to bring about any sort of resolution. They don't really know how to handle the behavior. They wouldn't know the first thing about any sort of reconciliation for the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah.
They have no idea.
And there's certain parents, I think Alex's parents were kind of like that. This was a joke we used to have when I was a kid, where your parents would say, "Oh, not my angel."
Right.
Not my angel.
Right.
He's not out there throwing cinder blocks off the overpass onto cars on the freeway. Not my angel. Not my kid.
Right.
You'd be surprised what your kids will do.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah, you'll be surprised how they'll get in trouble. Because I remember when I was a teenager, I got in a lot of trouble. I wound up in juvenile hall. I was drunk, criminal damage to property. I mean, we were doing things not quite as bad, but without the grace of God, like we probably would have. But we were not like normal, ideal children at all, or adolescents.
Have there
we
ever
were
been?
terrible?
I mean, do you think the Vikings had normal children? I mean,
well, Deuteronomy shows us that all you can't go too much further back than that.
Yeah,
right.
You really can't.
So let's look at this as we get ready here to kind of shut it off for time being. What is the cause, or what is the root effect of violent youth? And we're going to kind of debunk these. Many people say the broken home will cause the youth to go bad or to spoil. But Alex DeLarge has two supposedly loving parents. But the question is, do they really love him? Do they really know him? Do they really care enough about him to deal with the problems, deal with the issues, or do they really love him, or do they just let him do whatever he wants? Because if we're honest with ourselves, Dostoevsky says that love is a harsh and dreadful thing at times, and it's hard to confront all of these issues and all of these problems. It's easier to let your kids do whatever the hell they want to do.
Yeah.
But his home isn't broken.
No, his home isn't broken, but that in and of itself cannot be the barometer.
But they've used that for 30 years.
Of course, they've used it for longer than that, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So a mentor of mine says this: when a child learns authority before they learn their identity, you sow seeds of rebellion.
That's good.
And so when a child learns the lack of authority, right, before they learn their identity, you end up with the same result. You let the kid do whatever they want, you end up with a kid that doesn't regard authority, right, and has the seeds of rebellion. I'm going to do whatever I want. Conversely, you present too much authority and no identity, right? We, speaking from a Judeo-Christian perspective, it's what we talk about at New Life. It's what you and I talk about in lots of different settings. You have to know who you are in Christ. If you don't know who you are in Christ, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, you may come from a single-parent home. We act like that's sort of the lack of conventional marriage. That's the thing that broke society.
Ozzie and Harriet.
Right. But yet, you have parents that have been separated by war. In preparation for my message on Sunday, right, a denarius, a Roman soldier got paid $50 a day, a denarius.
Yeah.
The vineyard worker got paid $50 a day, a denarius. The difference between the two is that the vineyard worker had a significantly less chance of getting hit with a sharp object in the course of battle, right?
Yeah.
Like putting down a rebellion or something.
Yeah.
So, you have wars. Like the soil in Europe and the Middle East has been soaked in blood for millennia. Like, we've had broken homes, not because Daddy doesn't love me. Daddy might be laying dead on a battlefield somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? Or taken into slavery by some other nation. Like, those things happened.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the broken home. Well, Dad is an
because
absent
we're looking at it through the American
Absolutely.
lens.
Absolutely.
And like people have played with those ideas. Like Oliver Stone played with that idea with Natural Born Killers
Yes.
when he did Mickey Loves Mallory.
Yep.
Right? And like that home wasn't broken,
Nope.
but like the father was molesting
Yep.
the daughter, the son was completely miserable, and some homes they're not broken, but it would probably be better off if they were broken.
Yep.
But we have this black and white picket fence American concept of the American dream and apple pie and all of that garbage, and like we think that our life is supposed to be patterned and modeled after that, and I think that's where that misconception of the broken home comes from.
Yep. Chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.
Yeah, some people say a Cadillac home, a brick home and a Cadillac in the driveway.
Yep.
And that is America, and that is the American dream. And if you don't have those things, then you're not you're not truly an American.
Yep.
You're certainly not a patriot, and something's wrong with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and so these ideas are so interesting. Some of the cause and effects of the youth being violent and angry is the influence of certain types of music.
Mm-hmm.
But notice that Alex loves classical music.
Mm-hmm.
And that turns it upside down on its ear, because it's not necessarily the music itself.
Well, but if you were to go back, Beethoven was the heavy metal of his day.
Yeah, he was looked upon as a heretic, right?
Like all of them cats, though. Like every single
Mozart,
you
Paganini,
name any of them, they were like da-da-da-da. Nobody does that.
Yeah.
What are you doing? You can't do that to a piano.
But we see that music now as sublime, as angelic, as heavenly. But yet, you know what? Nazi soldiers would unwind with classical music after a hard day's work in the death camps.
Yeah, but I mean that's something made up. That's not.
But we bought
reality.
it and we like it, and especially Christians, we love that because that's the worldly music, and if you listen to Slayer, you're going to go out and you're going to kill everybody, and you're going to kill your parents, and you're going to you remember Sonic Youth, killing your parents, and they toyed with those ideas, and you know what? Not everybody that millions of people watched Taxi Driver, but there was one person, Hinckley, that went out and actually tried to kill the president.
Yeah.
But for one person to do that, there's been millions that have done that as well. The Columbine killers were associated with Marilyn Manson.
Yep.
Just a few years, actually quite a while. We're getting old, but remember they tried to blame Marilyn Manson that he influenced those boys to kill, and those boys didn't come from broken homes.
No.
Those boys were affluent. Those boys were wealthy. Those boys were rich. Things were not the trench coat mafia like we remember those things. Ozzy, Judas Priest, Two Live Crew, Slayer, rock and roll on trial, like all those things. So like
PMRC,
like you just can't blame it all on the music.
No, but we want a scapegoat.
Yeah, we've talked about that before.
We want to blame someone, and the one group we never ever want to blame is we don't want to turn inwardly.
They did that with this. Remember, he wouldn't show it for years and years and years with the film, right? Remember, Kubrick wouldn't show it in certain parts of the world, right? Because there were mock crimes, there were copycat crimes, because people saw the movie. and there was an awful sexual assault that was committed.
Yep.
And the boys were while they were committing the sexual assault, they testified that they were singing, they were doing the what was his name? Singing in the Rain.
Singing in the rain.
Kelly, what was his name?
Just singing in the rain.
And those things change you, like that imagery. Like when I hear Gene Kelly, like when I hear that song, like I don't think about the him, Fred Astaire, dancing around, swinging on the light pole with an umbrella. I don't think about that.
No.
I think about the awful images of Clockwork Orange.
Same.
Like I don't think about that.
Same.
Like the other night, we were watching. My wife Heather was watching that Cold Case show. Those reruns, and that song came on. I love you so. Please don't go. Remember, it was like a popular song. Don't go. And but because of Netflix and their interpretation of Jeff Dahmer, like every time I hear that song, like it ruins it. So like audio and visual images and sounds combined, they change our perception. They change the way we see the world. They change us, and it's not always for the best.
No,
but you can't blame it all exclusively on that.
No,
but we try.
We try. I had heard that Gene Kelly, but I'd never.
Oh yeah, he was angry about it.
I'd never seen Fred Astaire dancing. Right.
Yeah.
The music video for me is exactly as you described. It was when I saw it in Clockwork Orange. Right?
Yeah, Alex.
There's a lot of songs that way that, like, before music videos existed, you just heard the song on the radio, and then you see it in a movie, and you have that association, because that's what we do. We gravitate toward association.
Yeah. Apocalypse Now with Sheen drunk in his underwear with Jim Morrison. Like I'll never hear every time I see the end. Like I'm gonna think about Sheen.
Yeah.
And that underwear.
That's
drunk.
an image.
But I'm hardwired that way. I grew up that way. The TV was my babysitter. Like I grew up like that. So as we end, the totalitarian states, more laws and stiffer penalties prevent violent crime among youths. Clockwork Orange completely destroys that theory. It's a totalitarian state. And that is the point of the man, the bum, being abused and beat up in the alley, because he's like, I don't want us to live in this world anymore.
I don't want to live in this world anymore.
It's stinking kids like you, man on the moon, and all this kind of stuff. There's no law and order anymore because the government lets the kids get away with this stuff. And like the kids, I read about it. I read a lot of material about it as well, and they talk about how like the police were patrolling the streets, but the violent youth were patrolling the streets too. And they were walking the streets, and they were looking for weak people, and they were looking for people that they could take advantage of, and they were, in a sense, they were keeping it clean. It's a terrible way to say it, but like they were patrolling, and they were doing their own policing
to a degree.
And that's even happening now. Hence the man walking around with a ski mask. It's so you see these patterns. They keep happening over and over again. And and I was thinking about literature, cinematography, visual images. I was thinking about Charles Starkweather. He was obsessed with James Dean and true crime magazines, because like true crime magazines in the 40s and 50s, like that was pornography, because they had these very explicit drawings of women that were tied up and bound, and people breaking into houses and all kinds of awful things like that. Like that was their pornography. And back then, society at large blamed the problems on Rebel Without a Cause, The Wild One. These wild movies. They're changing. Reefer Madness. They're changing our youth. They're corrupting our youth. We've got to put a stop to these films. We've got to put a stop to art. We've got to put a stop to literature. And like when you start doing those things, like it's very destructive, and like it doesn't work because it's not right.
It doesn't end well at all.
So as we close, what are your thoughts? We're going to continue this Clockwork Orange series, and we're going to go more into the book, and we're going to hopefully try to make the connections with Scripture, the Bible, because the main emphasis of the book is the importance of free will, and that is a cornerstone of the Bible is free will. So these are very important ideas. They're very interesting ideas. So we started it with a question: rebellious youth, violent crime with the youth. Is it on the rise, or has it always been that way?
So I definitely think it's always been that way. Looking at the statistical data, in 1994, for example, the arrest rate was 477 out of 100,000, right? And there are so many more people on the planet today. There is so much more competition for resources. There are so many things that are publicized. There are so many things that are copycat. A lot of the stuff that we see is just offset by volume, right?
Yeah.
Like there is more, like if 1 in 10 children are going to commit a crime, and instead of there being 100,000 kids, there are now 10 million kids. Well, by its extension, there's going to be more of it. But per capita, right, based on the number of people per thousand, right, some of those numbers really haven't changed. And we have so many more kids that are doing so many wonderful and good things that we don't pay any attention to. Like kids that are inventing things. Kids that are out, like, it was once in a while you had the kid on the street corner selling lemonade. Now you've got different fundraising platforms where kids are raising millions of dollars for causes that are important to them. You have people that are doing altruistic actions, sometimes true altruism, sometimes thinly veiled as, whatever. But we can't say nothing happens in a vacuum. We can't say that there is more crime without saying there is also more good being done.
And that's one of the things I miss about being away from Bible college, is because I used to see so many young people. They wanted to preach the gospel. They wanted to change the world for Christ. And I didn't grow up with kids that wanted to do anything like that, but it was so refreshing to be 30 years old or 35 years old and see a 19, 20-year-old kid or girl with an anointing that really wanted to make a difference for the kingdom of God. And I missed that. Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because just because there are people that are always going to kind of be going the wrong direction, doing awful things, there is always good, because the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not put it out.
Hard to shine in the light, isn't it?
So we thank you for watching. Tune in, watch. If you have a comment, leave a comment, and we're going to keep going with A Clockwork Orange and the Bible. It sounds strange, but we're praying it will make sense. God bless you, and thank you.